The Quarterly, the Book of Isaiah, Lesson 4, Isaiah 9, 1 through 7, and 11, 1 through 9. A son is given. After the promise of the Emmanuel child in Isaiah 7, there are two more passages that focus on the arrival of a child in the opening chapters of Isaiah. The promised royal son of Isaiah 9 and Isaiah 11. Chapter 9 draws our attention to the names he will bear. Names that each combine a title of deity with a particular attribute that will mark him out. While chapter 11 shows us the impact that his coming will have, which is nothing less than ushering in a return to an Edenic state of harmony among all creation. In both cases, the expectations are too large to be engendered by the expectation of an ordinary member of the royal house of Judah. They anticipate an heir of the house of David who would transcend mere human qualities and come to usher in the promised kingdom of God. Isaiah 9 looks forward to a reversal of the former times of distress that were depicted for Judah in the previous chapters. That was especially good news for the far north of Israel, the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali, which was known as Galilee of the Gentiles. Isaiah 9:1. Not coincidentally, Galilee was the first place to be overrun by any attack on Israel from the north, the direction from which most of her enemies came during this period. The place that was first to be plunged into darkness would also be the first place to see the coming of the light. Verse 2. Forthcoming destruction of Judah would not be the end of their story. No, their mourning would be turned into joy. The yoke of the oppressor would be broken, and peace would reign forever with righteousness in a new kingdom. The deliverance that is promised would be a liberation as total as the day when Gideon defeated the Midianites in Judges 7. It would bring a total end to war. This dramatic transformation in the order of existence would not be brought about through the coming of a liberating army. Rather, it would come through the birth of a child who was born to be king. The government will be upon his shoulder, verse 6. That is, this child would grow up to be a ruler, unlike any before him. First, he will be called Wonderful Counselor. We might paraphrase this name as the possessor of divine wisdom. In the Old Testament, God is the only one who is wonderful or who does wonders. Meanwhile, the task of a counselor was to provide wisdom so that the king would know what to do in any circumstances. But this coming king will need no one to advise him, for he will always know the right thing to do. He will also be called Mighty God or the Divine Warrior. We might paraphrase this name as the possessor of divine power. Sometimes even the best of leaders can't enforce their wishes, but not so with this king. He is omnipotent. He is all-powerful. He is as powerful as God himself. And then he will be called Everlasting Father, literally the Father of eternity. This name we might render as the possessor of divine eternity. Only God is from everlasting to everlasting. Everything else is time-bound. Even those kings of Israel who were good leaders suffered from this fatal flaw. They eventually died, and their sons were no match for them. Not so this king, though. He knows the right thing to do, he is powerful enough to do it, and he is eternal, so that his impact is lasting. Finally, he will be named Prince of Peace. This we could render the possessor of divine reconciliation. Peace in Hebrew, shalom, means wholeness in all of our relationships, restored relationships with creation, with one another, and with God. This king will not simply be able to bring men grudgingly into line while their hearts resent him as if he's a divine dictator. No, this king will make all things new and everything as it should be. These names are displayed in action in the description of the coming king's activities in verse 7. Wisdom, power, eternity, and peace. What Israel most needed was a king who would be endowed with divine qualities in all of these different areas, so that he could not only deal with external problems, like oppression from Assyria, and the problems within society, man's ill treatment of his fellow man, but also with the internal and most basic problem, which is man's rebellion against God, which poisons all of our other relationships. Isaiah returns the prospect of the coming of a new and different king, one filled with God's Spirit, in chapter 11. This one is so different from the previous Davidic kings that he does not represent a continuation of the line of David so much as a whole new beginning from the stump of Jesse, David's father. In contrast to King Ahaz, who in Isaiah 7 absolutely refused to trust in the Lord, even when the Lord offered to give him a miraculous sign, this coming king will not make superficial judgments. He will not judge by what he sees with his eyes or decide by what he hears with his ears. Verse 3. Rather, he will have true wisdom and bring righteousness and justice for the poor and the oppressed, along with judgment upon the wicked. Verse 4. He speaks with power, issuing decrees from his mouth that are then translated immediately into action. This king comes with a belt, verse 5, so that he can gird up his robes, or as we would say, roll up his sleeves, and get right to work. And what's more, his belt is righteousness and faithfulness. So the work that he accomplishes is truth and justice. He is the original superhero action figure. The result of the coming of this king will be a kingdom unlike anything seen before in Israel, bringing about restored relationships between humans and the rest of creation. The wolf will move in and share an apartment with that most defenseless of animals, the lamb. The leopard will lie down and snuggle with the baby goat. The baby cow and the ferocious lion will walk together in the paddock, and a little child will lead them. Verse 6. A toddler will be able to play with a nest of poisonous snakes without coming to any harm. Verse 8. Isaiah is describing a world unlike anything we have ever experienced. Not least because in the Old Testament, the threat of Israel's land being overrun by wild animals was one of those covenant curses that was threatened for disobedience in Leviticus 26:22. Isaiah had already spoken of the certainty of the coming destruction of the land at the hands of brutal enemies, especially Assyria. And yet Isaiah envisaged a future world beyond all that, in which there would be no more fear of nature or foreign invaders, for the earth will then be as full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Verse 9. Indeed, what the prophet is describing is nothing less than a return to the way things were originally in the Garden of Eden before the fall, in Genesis 1 and 2. In those days, there was no fear of animals, nor were there any foreign invaders. Adam and Eve knew the Lord, that is, they were in a right relationship with God, and so everything else worked as it should. What Isaiah prophesies is that such a state will exist again because of the coming of this king and the knowledge of God that he will bring with him. He will restore man's relationship with God, and the result will be a total restoration of all creation, including our shattered relationships with one another. This new world order will be established by the root of Jesse, verse 10. The shoot from the same origins as David, as we saw back in verse 1, who will stand like a banner raised high on the battlefield, summoning his people to himself from all nations. The promised Messiah will draw the exiles of Israel and the people of Judah together in a harmonious unity, verse 12, in place of the conflict that had brought them to the brink of civil war in chapter 7. The Lord will then bring back the scattered remnant of his people, from all of the different places of exile to which they have been driven because of their sin. The Lord will open up a highway for the remnant of his people to return home, verse 16, which will create another Exodus, like the earlier one from Egypt, with millions of people marching out of bondage into a new future. All the old rivalries will be abolished. All the former hurts and fractures will be forgotten, in a new unity that stems from their mutual devotion to this new king. Application questions. 1. Which of the promised king's coming attributes, wisdom, power, eternity, or peace, do our current rulers lack? And which is the most important to bring in the promised kingdom? 2. How are these promises good news for Isaiah's original audience? And how are they good news for you and for me? 3. Why is hope such a key attribute for God's people? 4. How do these passages point forward to the coming of Jesus?